Most men don't wake up dreaming of blood. They begin as soft, smiling children, sensitive, obedient, even sweet. They try their best to follow the rules, to be what others need them to be. And yet, somewhere along the way, something inside them breaks. Not with a loud snap, but with a quiet silence. A silence that deepens year by year until it devours whatever warmth they once carried. Ted Bundy was one of those boys. Charming, articulate, well-dressed. A boy who kissed his mother goodnight and got good grades. A boy praised for how good he was, how polite, how clean-cut, how normal. But behind that normalcy lived a storm. Not a sudden explosion of evil, but a slow erosion of self. You see, evil does not erupt, it accumulates. And beneath every cold-blooded act, there is often a soul that has gone numb. A man who has forgotten how to feel, because feeling, once upon a time, got him hurt. Ted didn't grow up in a war zone. But not all violence is physical. Sometimes, the wounds are invisible, stitched in shame, stitched in secrets. His childhood was a maze of lies. Raised believing his mother was his sister. Lied to about his own origin. Humiliation dressed up as protection. It may seem minor, but when a child cannot even trust the truth of who he is, what solid ground is left? He learned early that love came with conditions. That smiles could be masks. That no one would come if he screamed. And so he stopped screaming. Many boys do. They learn to stay quiet. They learn to be charming instead of honest. They learn to seduce instead of connect. They build masks that smile wide and eyes that sparkle, but inside, they are starving. Not for sex, not for power. For recognition. For something real. Because deep in the nervous system of the so-called monster is often a man who feels utterly invisible. Some men deal with this wound by shrinking. Others, like Ted, inflate. He built an image. The golden boy. The law student. The boyfriend. The helper. Even working at a suicide prevention hotline. It's almost too ironic. A man destined to destroy life, saving it for strangers on the phone. But that's the thing about many damaged men, they know how to perform empathy. They learned it as survival. Because if they can mirror your needs, you won't look too closely at theirs. Beneath his confident swagger was not self-esteem, but grandiosity. The kind born from a shattered ego desperate to matter. Grandiosity is not pride. It is the disguise of unworthiness. And when the mask begins to crack, when rejection or humiliation strikes, it does not wound the surface. It slices through the core. You may think a breakup is just a breakup. But to the man who has built his entire identity around being desirable, being chosen, being adored, it is death. This is not about excusing him. This is not about pity. This is about understanding the roots. Because until we understand, we will keep producing more men like him. Men who cannot cry. Men who cannot lose without crumbling. Men who were told that weakness is shame and shame must be hidden at all costs. Even if it means burying it under corpses. What if I told you that many of the darkest crimes are not acts of confidence, but of collapse? That beneath the cruelty is often a wounded ego gasping for breath, lashing out because feeling small is more unbearable than making others suffer? Have you ever met a man who'd rather be feared than forgotten? That's what Ted became. But he didn't begin there. And maybe that's what should scare us most. Because if evil always wore a villain's face, we'd know to run. But evil often wears a suit. Smiles. Holds doors open. Evil can look like a man who once held a baby bird gently in his hand. A man who once wanted nothing more than to be loved. Some say evil is born. But the truth is often more tragic than that. It's built. Layer by layer. Shame by shame. And what begins as a boy's longing to belong can slowly harden into a man's compulsion to control, to dominate, to destroy, just to feel real again. Ted Bundy didn't snap. He eroded. Behind the headlines and courtroom tapes, behind the smooth voice and calculated calm, there lived a quiet terror the terror of being nothing. The terror of being seen without the mask. Of being ordinary. Of being unlovable. This fear, this gnawing emptiness, doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes, it looks like perfectionism. Like charisma. Like obsession with power, or status, or being the smartest man in the room. But it is still fear. The fear of being found out. The fear of being discarded. Have you ever met a man who could not stand to be ignored? In the early years, Ted was good at hiding it. He was magnetic, attentive, even endearing. He mirrored people so well that many believed he was what he projected. But masking is not connection. It is theater. And when you play a role for too long, something begins to rot underneath. Because no one sees the real you. Because you no longer know who that is. And here is where the fracture deepens. When the pain of invisibility collides with the pressure to seem perfect, men like Ted begin to split. A part of them remains the polished performer, doing everything right, collecting approval like currency. But another part, the angry, unseen, rejected part, festers in the shadows. That hidden part carries all the rage, all the shame, all the unmet grief. And when it erupts, it doesn't ask for healing. It asks for revenge. Against the women who didn't want them. Against the society that mocked them. Against the world that made them feel like ghosts. And so the murders began. Not because he loved death, but because it was the only time he felt fully alive. Fully in control. Fully seen. This is not about condoning what he did. There is no justification for cruelty. But cruelty often has roots. And the more we deny those roots, the more we blind ourselves to how they grow. You might wonder how someone so intelligent, so articulate, could become so monstrous. But intelligence does not protect the soul. If anything, it can sharpen the blade of delusion. It builds justifications. It rationalizes suffering. It becomes a tool for manipulation instead of insight. And when self-awareness is too painful, intellect becomes armor. You've probably met a man like this. Not a killer, but someone who wears masks. Someone who can't say I'm hurting, so instead he says nothing, or worse, lashes out. A man who smiles at work but screams in silence. A man who breaks things he loves because tenderness terrifies him. That's the quiet tragedy. The descent into darkness is rarely dramatic. It is often mundane. 1,000 small disconnections. 1,000 swallowed cries. 1,000 times a boy says, I'm fine, when he isn't. By the time Ted Bundy was on trial, the world called him evil. But the truth is, evil was only the final mask. Beneath it lived a boy still trying to prove he mattered. What would have happened if someone had seen through it sooner? If someone had told him he didn't have to be perfect to be loved? That he was allowed to be hurt without becoming cruel? What would happen if we told all our boys that? Because the worst thing you can do to a child is teach him to bury his pain. That buried pain doesn't disappear, it waits. It mutates. It grows teeth. You don't have to be a killer to relate to this. Maybe you've buried parts of yourself too. Maybe there are wounds you've told no one about. Maybe there's a voice in you that whispers you're not enough unless you perform. But hear this, the pain doesn't make you dangerous. It's the hiding that does. Pain, when seen, can be softened. When named, it can be healed. When embraced, it can become your strength. But when denied, it becomes your cage. The cage is not made of steel. It's made of silence. Silence about what hurt you. Silence about the nights you cried into your pillow as a boy, only to wake up and pretend nothing happened. Silence about the anger you weren't allowed to express, because good boys don't get angry, they smile, they behave, they obey. But unspoken pain doesn't vanish. It just finds other ways to live. In men like Ted, that silence turned into a double life. The charming exterior was just a well-polished shell. Inside, there was a storm of unmet needs, fractured identity, and unbearable shame. But it was shame so buried that even he couldn't name it anymore. He only knew the feeling it left behind, a cold, gnawing emptiness. A void that success couldn't fill. That women couldn't fix. That control couldn't soothe. So he hunted, not just for bodies, but for something deeper. The illusion of power. The illusion of significance. For a few brief moments, when he held life in his hands, he could believe he was real. That is the psychology of annihilation. Not random madness, but methodical desperation. A fantasy of control crafted by someone who has spent his entire life feeling out of control of his story, his emotions, his place in the world. And yet, in court, people stared at him with confusion. He was so normal. How could he do such things? But that is the most dangerous myth we tell ourselves, that monsters always look like monsters. That evil is obvious. That if someone is smart, clean, educated, well-mannered, they must be safe. No. Sometimes, the most terrifying darkness is hidden behind the brightest smiles. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and seen nothing? A vacancy so eerie, it's as if the soul left long ago? That's not a symptom of being born evil. That's the residue of long-term emotional starvation. When you're not mirrored as a child, when no one reflects your feelings, when no one welcomes your pain, you stop knowing how to feel at all. This is alexithymia, the inability to name or process emotions. It's common in trauma survivors, especially men, who were raised to treat vulnerability as a sin. They become masters at managing impressions, at charming others without ever connecting, at saying all the right things while hiding everything that hurts. Ted was a master. He seduced the court, journalists, even women who wrote him love letters from prison. They didn't see a killer, they saw the mask. The articulate, ambitious, handsome young man who looked nothing like the face of evil they expected. But the mask wasn't real. It was the last defense of a boy who was too afraid to be seen. You may not relate to his crimes, but you might relate to his pain, to the pressure of being the good son, to the ache of feeling like you're never enough, to the fear that if people saw who you really were, they'd leave. So you hide it. You play the role. You survive. But what you don't express owns you. And over time, that hidden grief begins to twist. It becomes cynicism. It becomes manipulation. Sometimes it becomes rage. And if you don't know how to cry, sometimes all that's left is to hurt others just to feel something again. We are not born numb. We become numb when feeling becomes too dangerous. We are not born violent. We become violent when no one listens to our pain until it screams. And that's what many men carry, a pain so deep, so silent, it eventually erupts, not in tears, but in destruction. If no one teaches a boy how to process grief, he will carry it in his fists. If no one teaches him how to sit with shame, he'll spend his life trying to escape it, through women, work, power, or violence. That's the tragedy behind Ted Bundy. Not just what he did, but what he never got to heal. Because by the time his pain found a voice, it was already too late. But it doesn't have to be too late for others. And maybe that's the real point of telling his story. Not to glorify him. Not to excuse him. But to understand how even the most terrifying evil can begin in something so heartbreakingly human. The fear of being unloved. Imagine being a child and realizing, long before you have the words for it, that love is conditional. That your worth is based not on who you are, but on how well you perform. On how well you hide your anger, suppress your sadness, wear the right smile. Now imagine growing up in a world that rewards the mask and punishes the wound. This is the quiet crucible many boys endure. And from that crucible, they emerge not whole, but split. One self for the world, likable, intelligent, composed. Another buried deep, terrified, furious, unworthy. Ted Bundy was not raised by wolves. He was raised by silence, secrets, and shame. His family didn't beat him with fists, they beat him with confusion. Emotional dishonesty. Mistrust disguised as care. And while the world saw a normal household, the boy inside lived in a haunted one. He was never allowed to fully be. Not emotionally. Not authentically. His core identity was built on denial of his origins, his feelings, his needs. It is not a coincidence that someone raised in this level of emotional gaslighting would grow up to master manipulation. When your truth is denied as a child, you learn to twist reality. You learn to manipulate perception just to survive. And manipulation isn't always malicious, it's often a trauma response. When Ted discovered the truth about his birth, that the woman he called sister was actually his mother, his internal reality shattered. The lie unraveled. The humiliation was unbearable. And humiliation is not a minor wound, it's a psychic blow. It tells a person, you are a joke. You are not real. You are less than human. Some boys retreat into themselves after such betrayals. Others try to prove themselves. Ted did both. But deep inside, something else was brewing, a rage he couldn't name, because he wasn't allowed to be angry. A shame so toxic, he couldn't process it, only project it. And so he targeted women. Not just because of rejection, not just because of his fractured relationship with his mother, but because in his mind, women became symbols. Symbols of what he could never have: genuine connection, vulnerability, freedom. He both desired and despised them. He needed them to see him, but once they did, he hated them for holding that power. This is the pathology of the wounded narcissist, not the man who loves himself too much, but the man who feels so deeply defective that he builds a false self to survive. That false self is grandiose, seductive, bulletproof. But it's not real. It's armor forged in childhood. And the deeper the wound, the harder the armor. By the time Ted Bundy began killing, he was no longer reacting to the women in front of him. He was reacting to phantoms. To echoes of humiliation. To the deep, paralyzing fear of being small, being rejected, being unseen. Because a man who cannot tolerate vulnerability will often attack what reminds him of it. And our culture breeds this pathology. We teach boys to dominate, not feel. To pursue control instead of connection. To silence their grief with conquest. We praise the mask and pathologize the emotion underneath. So when a man finally breaks, when the mask slips, it looks sudden. But it's not. It's years of grief ignored. Years of rage swallowed. Years of pretending everything was fine. You've seen this in smaller ways. The man who explodes at his girlfriend over nothing, because deep down, he feels unworthy of love. The man who ghosts people instead of saying, I'm scared to get close. The man who works himself into the ground, chasing achievements, because rest feels like failure. The man who clings to power, because power makes him feel safe. These aren't evil men. They're wounded ones. And not all become killers. But the path begins in the same place: silence, shame, and the belief that if anyone saw the real you, they'd leave. Ted Bundy wasn't just a murderer. He was a mirror. A mirror of what happens when emotional wounds are left to rot. When a boy isn't taught to feel. When love is earned, not given. When pain is punished instead of held. He wore the mask of the perfect man. But the mask was the monster. The real horror wasn't the violence, it was the emptiness underneath. Because long before he hurt others, Ted Bundy was already lost to himself. There is something unspeakably tragic about a man who can no longer feel his own heart. Not because it makes him evil, but because it makes him unreachable. By the time Ted Bundy reached death row, he had become more performance than person. Interviews, appeals, charm turned up like a stage light. Even in his final hours, he still spoke as if from behind a glass wall, narrating his life with clinical distance, as if it were someone else's story. Because in many ways, it was. The self he once was, the frightened, fractured child, had long ago been buried beneath a persona designed not to heal, but to survive. You may think, what's the point of dissecting this? He killed. He lied. He ruined lives. Yes, he did. But if we cannot face the emotional roots of these horrors, we will keep creating them. We will keep raising boys who believe that numbness is strength, that pain is weakness, that their worth depends on how well they can pretend. Ted was not the only man walking around with a fractured soul wrapped in a tailored suit. You see it in boardrooms, in marriages, in schools, in churches. Men who smile while dying inside. Men who are praised for being strong, when what they really are is scared. Scared of being abandoned. Scared of being humiliated. Scared of being nothing. And when no one teaches them how to hold that fear with compassion, they learn to fight it instead. Sometimes through control. Sometimes through manipulation. Sometimes, tragically, through violence. But even violence has a root. And that root is often grief. Grief for the childhood they never had. Grief for the innocence they lost too early. Grief for the love that was never unconditional. We live in a culture that pathologizes emotion and glorifies power. So it's no surprise that some men confuse domination with healing. But power is not the antidote to shame. Connection is. And that's what Ted Bundy never found. Not truly. He had lovers. Friends. A life that, on paper, looked full. But when your love is a performance, you are always alone. That's why his crimes were so ritualistic. So controlled. He wasn't just killing. He was reclaiming his narrative, by force. Trying to silence the part of him that felt humiliated, discarded, powerless. This is how unprocessed shame can metastasize. It becomes a drive. A fixation. A dark ritual to undo the wound. But shame cannot be undone through domination. It can only be healed through acceptance. And he never got that. Neither did the women he hurt. They never got justice, or healing, or safety. They are not footnotes to his pain. They are lives shattered by it. Which is why this story must be told carefully. Not to sympathize with him, but to humanize the process. So we can stop it from happening again. Because you do not prevent monsters by calling them monsters. You prevent monsters by understanding the boy before he breaks. You teach him how to cry. How to ask for help. How to feel his anger without becoming it. How to feel his shame without drowning in it. And you remind him, over and over, that he is more than the mask. That he is not weak for feeling. He is human. Maybe if Ted had heard those words, his story would have ended differently. But it didn't. And we are left with a cautionary tale, not just about one man's descent into horror, but about the emotional poverty that made it possible. Because no man becomes violent without first becoming numb. No man becomes numb without first being wounded. And no wound ever truly disappears. It waits. Until someone finally listens. Until someone finally says, "You are allowed to feel." He wasn't angry because he was bad. He was angry because he was broken. Ted Bundy didn't look like a monster. He looked like a good man. Because he learned early to perform. To hide the shame, the rejection, the emptiness. That's the real danger. When boys are taught to bury pain behind a perfect mask. And no one sees what's rotting underneath. We tell this story not to excuse evil, but to understand where it begins. In silence, in secrets, in wounds that never healed. If this opened your eyes, leave a like. Share it with someone still hiding. Subscribe if you believe truth is not weakness. It's the first step toward never repeating this.